Death did not arrive like a thief in Rome. It was expected, respected, even prepared for. And when it came, Rome greeted it not with fear, but with ritual. The final moments. A Roman dying at home was never alone. When the end neared, family gathered in silence. Lamps were dimmed. Perfumed oils were burned. A favorite memory was softly whispered. And when the breath faltered, one person, often the closest, leaned forward and gently caught the last breath with a kiss. Expirivit, he has breathed out his soul. The closing of the eyes. As the body stilled, someone closed the eyes, slowly, with 2 fingers. Then whispered, "Veil, farewell." Not a scream. Not a cry. Just that single word. A farewell that echoed through marble halls and wooden homes alike. Silence, then action. Once the soul had left, grief was set aside for duty. Immediately, the family began the ritual sequence. The body was laid on the ground, to return it to the earth. A coin was placed under the tongue or over the eyes, Karen Zabel. The hands were folded across the chest. A white cloth covered the face. The room was washed with water and smoke. This was not decoration. It was a conversation with the divine. The role of the eldest. The eldest son or daughter took charge. They lit the first ceremonial lamp, informed the household gods, lares, sent word to extended family, summoned the undertaker, priest, and musicians. They spoke little. They walked slowly. Because from now till the burial, time moved differently. The body must rest. For a day or two, the body was laid in the atrium, the front room. It was not hidden. It was not feared. Visitors came to touch the feet, leave olive branches, whisper prayers, sit in silence. Children were told, "He walks in another world now, but he hears you still." The wake, conclamatio. Before the procession could begin, one final act was performed. A family member stood at the head, and 3 times called the name of the dead aloud. Marcus, Marcus, Marcus. Each call was softer, slower, until the name vanished into stillness. It was believed this helped the soul let go of the world behind. The home was marked. After the body was removed, the house was declared polluted, funesta. No cooking, no worship, no laughter. A laurel wreath was hung on the door. It told the neighbors, "Do not knock. Grief lives here." The women's grief. In private rooms, women grieved with open faces, hair undone, cheeks unwashed, garments torn, arms scratched in mourning. Some sang threnodies, ancient wailing songs. Some rocked slowly, as if carrying absence in their arms. Grief, for them, was not to be hidden. It was to be lived out loud, until ritual calmed the heart. The day before the procession, a priest arrived to purify the path, burn herbs around the doorway, bless the coffin with oil. The undertakers, libidonarii, arranged the bier, wooden stretcher, the funeral clothes, usually white, often the toga pura, the flowers, mostly cypress and rosemary, the musicians and professional mourners. And as night fell, the city waited. Because at dawn, the dead would take their last walk through Rome. The dead did not leave Rome quietly. They were seen. They were honored. They were given to the city one last time. The time of departure. At dawn, just as the sky softened into gray, the family gathered at the door. The body was placed on a bier, a wooden stretcher lined with cloth. If it was a man of status, he wore his best toga. If a woman, her veil and jewelry. If a child, flowers wove through the hair. The face was uncovered. Because the world had one last chance to look and remember. Who led the procession? A Roman funeral was theater with soul. The procession moved like this. Musicians, flutes, horns, slow drums. Mourners, hired women who wept and wailed in rhythm. Actors, wearing wax masks of ancestors, imagines. Family members, walking with heads bowed. The body, carried on shoulders or a decorated cart. Slaves and attendants, holding torches and offerings. Friends and clients, trailing behind in long silence. Sometimes, animals like sacrificial bulls or funerary birds walked too. Symbols of the soul's journey. The masks of memory. The most haunting part? The ancestral masks. Actors wore the faces of the family's forefathers. Wrinkled. Weathered. Expressionless. They did not speak. They simply walked, ahead of the body. Because the dead never travel alone in Rome. They are escorted by those who came before. The route through the city. The route past the forum, so the public could see. Past temples, where priests stood in respect. By statues and arches, marking the journey with grandeur. Through silent markets, shops closed, heads bowed. Children stood by mothers. Old men took off their head coverings. And the city held its breath as the body passed. It was said, "A man's worth is known by how his street falls silent." Public honors. If the deceased was famous, a general, senator, or poet, the procession stopped in the forum. There, a eulogy, laudatio, was spoken. A son or colleague stood beside the body and said, "He was honest. He was brave. He gave Rome his best years. We will not forget." Sometimes crowds wept. Sometimes they cheered. Always, they remembered. Children in the crowd. Young boys were often told, "Watch. This is how a Roman dies." It was education, not just grief. Rome taught its youth not only how to live, but how to leave the world with dignity. The music. The flutes played slow, hollow melodies. Not joyful. Not tragic. Just eternal. The rhythm was steady, matching footsteps and sorrow alike. And above it all, the wails of mourners rose and fell like waves. Because Rome didn't hide grief. It sang with it. The final turn. As the procession neared the gates of the city, the path narrowed. The crowds thinned. The air shifted. Because outside the gates, the city ended. And the realm of the dead began. When Rome burned the dead, it did not destroy them. It released them. The journey outside the city. Roman law forbade cremation within the city walls. So the procession exited through the city gates, following the old roads to the necropolis, the city of the dead. This was not a place of fear. It was a place of transition. Rows of tombs. Shrines of marble. Silence pierced by birdsong. The bier was laid near the funeral pyre, already stacked with olive wood and laurel branches. Preparing the pyre, undertakers and slaves built the ragas, the cremation platform. Logs arranged with airflow gaps. Dried herbs, incense, and resins mixed with kindling. Garlands of rosemary tied to the outer frame. Coins, wine, and honey placed beneath. The body was placed on top. Sometimes in a simple linen wrap. Sometimes dressed in full dignity. A torch was prepared, but not yet lit. The family circle. The mourners stood in a half-circle around the pyre. Closest family held oil lamps. Children clutched olive leaves. Elders stood still, hands behind their backs. The eldest son held the torch. No one spoke. Because the flame listens. Lighting the fire. At the final moment, a priest murmured a prayer to Mercury, the guide of souls. Then the son stepped forward. With shaking hands, he lit the torch from a small sacred flame, and touched it to the base of the pyre. The fire sighed before it roared. And as the flames climbed, no one wept aloud. Because this was not an end. It was a release. Watching the fire burned for hours. And in that time, the family remembered. The city waited. The birds circled. The soul, they believed, rose through the smoke. The Romans watched with open eyes. They did not look away. Because to turn your back was to deny that life had weight. Offerings to the flame. One by one, people stepped forward and gave. A flower. A lock of hair. A folded note. A ring. A handful of soil. They whispered. Remember. Forgive. Carry this. Be light. The fire accepted everything. It refused nothing. The flame dies down. When only ash remained. Water was poured to cool the embers. A young girl stepped forward. With a ceramic urn. The ashes were gathered gently. Fragments of bone, pieces of charred laurel, a few metal buttons. All swept together into silence. The home cleansing. Afterward, the family returned home for ritual purification. Bathed in spring water. Dressed in clean robes. Swept the floors with rosemary. Lit a lamp and left it burning all night. For 9 days, they mourned quietly. No banquets. No business. No music. Only remembrance. And waiting for the final ritual. The tomb and the soul's resting place. A Roman tomb was not the end of a life. It was the beginning of remembrance. The path to the tomb. After the ashes cooled, they were placed in an urn, usually made of terracotta, bronze, marble, glass, for the wealthy. This urn was wrapped in cloth, tied with ribbon, and carried through the city, not in procession, but in quiet reverence. The family whispered, "Come home. Your last journey is here. We built this for you. You belong." Where were tombs built? Roman law required tombs to stand outside city walls, along the roads leading in and out of town. Because the dead were not hidden, they were placed where everyone passed by. It was Rome's way of saying, "Do not forget. These are our people. This is who we were." Types of tombs. There was no one way to bury the Roman dead. They built columbaria, underground niches for urns. Family mausoleums, large, multi-generational tomb houses. Tomb towers, tall, visible monuments beside major roads. Altar tombs, shaped like miniature temples. Simple steely, vertical stone slabs with inscriptions. Rich or poor, senator or freed slave. All were remembered. But the form matched the life. A soldier's tomb looked like strength. A mother's tomb looked like love. A child's tomb looked like a garden. The epitaph. No Roman tomb was complete without an epitaph. Carved in Latin, it said who the person was, what they did, who they left behind, what the living should remember. Some were poetic. "I held my wife's hand for 32 years. She now sleeps in the stars." Some were humorous. "Don't dig here. I paid for this spot." Some were pleading. "Stranger, do not walk past without a word. I was once as you are." Even silence had a voice. When carved into stone. The ceremony of placement. At the tomb, the family gathered for the final rite. A priest lit incense. A drop of wine was poured on the earth. The urn was placed inside the tomb. Flowers were scattered. A short prayer was whispered. Children pressed their palms to the tomb wall. Elders leaned forward and kissed the stone. It was not a goodbye. It was a homecoming. The tomb became a place of life. Romans visited tombs regularly. On anniversaries. On birthdays. On spring mornings. On lonely evenings. They brought fresh flowers, lamps, toys, for children's tombs, bread and cheese, little cups of wine. And they spoke to the stone. Not to the rock, but to the person behind it. "Your granddaughter is growing. I miss your singing. We are well. Are you? Sleep peacefully." Why it mattered. Romans believed the dead needed a name, a place, a memory, a voice. Without these, the soul wandered, lost between worlds. So they carved the name. They built the place. They passed down the memory. They whispered the voice. This was not mourning. It was love, made of stone. When a Roman died, their story did not end. It simply passed into a different realm. The 3 parts of the soul. Romans believed the soul had layers. Manus, the divine part, honored by the family. Lemures, the restless dead, spirits without peace. Larvae, malevolent spirits, angry or forgotten. Death was not a doorway to one place, but a forked path. The memory of the dead shaped which soul remained behind, and which one moved on. The journey of the shade. The moment breath left the body, a shade, umbra, slipped out. It was light as mist, but carried all the person's thoughts, desires, memories, and wounds. Mercury, the divine guide, led this shade to the mouth of the underworld. There, it stood, awaiting its coin to cross. Charon the ferryman. Charon was the boatman. Dark, hooded, silent. He ferried souls across the river Styx. But only those who had a proper burial, received a coin, Karen Zabel, were not forgotten. If no coin was placed, or if the body was left unburied, the soul waited forever at the shore. A ghost. Unmoving. Unseen. Unremembered. The gates of the underworld. Beyond the river lay the gates, guarded by Cerberus, the three-headed dog. Only souls who had no unfinished business, no cursed fate, no lingering bitterness, could pass without struggle. For others, the journey continued, and wandering, they became lemures, and visited the world on dark nights. The afterlife places. The Roman afterlife was not heaven and hell. It had many regions, depending on the soul. Fields of asphodel, for ordinary souls, where shadows wandered quietly. Elysium, the bright, peaceful realm for the virtuous and brave. Tartarus, a pit of punishment for the wicked, traitors, and oath-breakers. The mourning fields, for souls undone by love and heartbreak. Even in death, emotion mattered. Even love could carve geography. The soul remembered. Romans believed that remembrance nourished the dead. Every prayer, every offering, every name spoken aloud, was like bread and water to the manus. If a family stopped visiting, if the name faded from stone, the soul began to weaken. That's why epitaphs often pleaded, "Passerby, speak my name. Pour a drop of wine. Let me not vanish." Festivals of the dead. Rome had specific days for honoring the dead. Parentalia, February 13th to 21st, families visited tombs, feasted, lit candles. Feralia, February 21st, the final rite, gifts left for the ancestors. Lemuria, May 9th, 11, 13, night rituals to drive out angry spirits. On these days, homes were cleaned. Doors were sprinkled with black beans. And prayers were whispered at midnight. Because peace with the dead meant peace for the living. The soul's transformation. If remembered well, the soul slowly transformed. From shade to spirit. From spirit to ancestor. From ancestor to guardian. Some became household gods, watching over kitchens, children, and harvests. The dead, in time, became family again. In Rome, death had a face, and the living wore it. The imagines, ancestral masks. When a Roman noble died, a wax mask was made from their face, poured over the skin before burial, molded to capture wrinkles, scars, lips, set with glass or painted eyes. Sometimes even hair was preserved. These were called imagines, images. But they were more than images. They were presences. Where were they kept? These masks were stored in a special room of the house, called the tablinum or sacrarium, arranged in rows or in wooden cabinets. Each mask labeled with the name and title. Some homes had dozens. Visitors often stood silently before them, because each face was once warm, once breathing, once loved. Who could have masks? Only patrician families, the noble elite, had the right to make and keep ancestral masks. But every Roman, rich or poor, had a version of this memory. Painted portraits, name tablets, oil lamps carved with faces, small clay heads. Because Rome knew, to forget a face is to lose a person. The procession of the dead faces. At noble funerals, actors wore these masks. They dressed in the ancestors' clothing, stood tall, and walked in front of the new dead. A man who died at 70 might be preceded by 8-10 ancestral faces, walking silently through the forum. Some said it was like Rome's memory walking again. No living name walked alone. They were escorted by generations of silence. The power of the face. Romans believed the face held identity more than the name. A name could be changed. A title could be lost. But the face, that could not lie. To look at the mask was to say, "You lived. I see it. I see you." And to wear it, even for a ritual, was to say, "I carry you forward." Ritual use of the masks. Masks were not just for storage or display. They were used in funerals, parentalia, ancestral days, family oaths, coming-of-age ceremonies. Sometimes, a boy becoming a man would be brought to the room of masks, asked to look into their eyes, and say, "I will not shame you." The ancestors became witnesses of life. Philosophical reflections. Writers like Cicero, Livy, and Seneca often spoke of the masks as mirrors of virtue, as warnings against corruption, as encouragement in times of doubt. One poet wrote, "I stood before my grandfather's mask, and remembered why I stood at all. A mask left behind. Sometimes, a mask was damaged. A face cracked by time. The family repaired it with gold leaf, or wrapped it in linen, because even a broken face still held the soul." They could not speak, but Rome made sure they were never silenced. Not every Roman was buried with honor, but every Roman was buried somewhere. The forgotten dead. For every noble with a marble tomb, there were hundreds whose bodies were too poor for a pyre, too young for a name, too sinful for a priest, too sick for remembrance. These were the nameless, yet not absent from history. Infants and children. In ancient Rome, infant mortality was high, and children under the age of 40 days were not granted full funeral rites. Their bodies were wrapped in cloth, placed in small clay jars, dolia, buried under house floors, courtyards, or gardens. Sometimes, a mother would plant a flower or olive tree above the spot. No stone, no name, but the roots remembered. Slaves and servants. Slaves had no legal personhood. In death, they often shared communal graves, were cremated without ceremony, buried on estate edges or behind stables. Yet some masters allowed private rites. A simple inscription, a shared urn, a whispered farewell from a fellow slave. Even in bondage, grief found its voice. The poor. For the very poor, Rome had mass graves, called puticuli, pits of rot, located outside city walls, filled daily with bodies wrapped in straw. No prayers, no offerings. And yet, sometimes, someone would sneak in after dark, leave a flower, a crust of bread, a small carved figure. A last kindness no one asked for, but no soul forgot. Criminals and the cursed. Certain deaths were considered polluting. Executed criminals, traitors, witches, those who died by suicide. These bodies were denied rights, buried at crossroads, left exposed, if unclaimed. Romans feared their return as lemures, restless, bitter spirits. So even when buried in disgrace, rituals were secretly done by families, just in case the gods were still listening. Foreigners and outsiders. Non-Romans, especially foreigners, travelers, or the enslaved from distant provinces, were buried in designated zones, often marked in native scripts. Greek, Punic, Hebrew, Celtic. Rome's empire was vast, and its graveyards told the story of conquest, longing, and exile. Women who died in childbirth. These women were mourned privately, their names often left unspoken due to fear, shame, or sorrow. But some husbands built small shrines, carved with doves, fruit, or swaddled infants, hidden in garden corners, lit with tiny lamps. The whisper. She gave life, and became memory. The grave beyond rites. In every Roman field, behind every vineyard wall, in every broken columbarium niche, there are bodies Rome never recorded. But the earth took them, and the wind remembered their names. They may not be in history books, but they are in the weight of Rome's soil. Grief in Rome was not hidden. It was practiced, like prayer, measured, like music, and completed, like a journey. Day 1, the death. The body is gone. The ashes sealed. The tomb visited. But the house is not the same. The threshold is swept. The lamps are dim. The family enters mourning, formally and visibly. Everyone wears old or darkened clothes, unwashed hair, no jewelry or perfume, soft-soled sandals. Even silence has a dress code. The ritual of polluted space. The home is now funesta, ritually impure. During mourning, no fires lit for cooking, no sacrifices made to household gods, no business transacted. No marriages, celebrations, or music. The hearth is cold. The kitchen quiet. The altar veiled. Because even the gods are asked to pause. The 9-day timeline. Each day had meaning. Not always spoken, but felt. Absence. Memory. Ritual. Cleansing. Silence. Whispered prayer. Offerings. Preparation. Release. By the 9th day, grief had been shaped into something livable. Daily offerings. Each day, a small libation was poured. Wine. Milk. Honey. Sometimes just water. It was poured into the earth, near the family altar. With words like, sleep. Return in dreams. We still remember. Sometimes a child lit a candle. Sometimes a widow left a fig. Grief was measured in simple gestures. The role of the women. Roman women led mourning inside the home. Kept lamps burning. Swept the floors at dawn. Rewove the altar garlands. Taught the children the names of the dead. Their grief was not only personal. It was generational. They carried the memory of others' mourning, too. The priest returns. On the 9th day, the priest returned to the house. He purified the hearth with smoke. Blessed the family with spring water. Lifted the veil from the altar. Whispered sacred words at the doorway. Then declared, "The house is clean. The living may rise again." The funeral banquet, Senula. After sunset, the family gathered. A simple meal, bread, eggs, lentils, wine. Served on low tables. Eaten with fingers, slowly, with music or silence. One plate was left empty, for the dead. Sometimes, a crumb was placed on the windowsill. Or a sit poured to the ground. Because though the ritual ended, the love did not. Guests and gifts. Friends came with olive branches, woven garlands, small coins for the tomb, words, veil. Sit tibi terra levis, farewell. May the earth lie light upon you. And as they left, they touched the hand of the mourning family. A small, wordless reminder. You are not alone. Grief after ritual. On the 10th day, Rome resumed. Markets reopened. Lamps burned bright. Children returned to play. Priests gave offerings once again. But the family remembered. In private, in dreams, in the way they looked at empty chairs. Ritual had not erased the pain. It had made space for it to be lived. When an emperor died, Rome paused and prepared the heavens. The emperor is dead. When a Roman emperor passed away, the Senate declared divus, divine. Messengers rode out to provinces. Temples hung black veils. Coins were minted with his face, now haloed. Even before cremation, he became half god, half memory. Lying in state, the emperor's body was embalmed, draped in white and purple, crowned with laurel, placed in a golden room within the Palatine Hill. Guards stood by. Flute players played day and night. Poets whispered verses beside flickering lamps. Citizens walked past, whispering. Avenue. Veil. Divus Augustus. Divus Hadrianus. The funeral procession. On the 7th day, Rome turned to watch its master's last walk. Soldiers marched in silence. Senators carried golden torches. Priests swung censers with thick incense. Actors wore masks of emperors past. Children scattered petals. The body, or its wax effigy, lay in a golden litter, carried by 12 men in white. The procession moved slowly, from the Palatine to the Field of Mars. The people stood still, as if holding the world in their breath. The funeral tower, Ragus. In the Field of Mars, a massive funeral pyre had been built, several stories high, covered in gold cloth and stars. Statues of gods on every level. At the top, a chariot sculpture, holding the effigy. It looked less like firewood, and more like a temple ready to launch. The divine ascension. At sunset, a priest lit the base. Flames crept upward like serpents of light. As the tower burned, a caged eagle was released from the top, rising into the dusk sky. Crowds wept. Priests chanted. The Senate bowed. Because that eagle was not just a bird. It was the emperor's soul, rising to join the gods. Apotheosis, becoming a god. After the cremation, the Senate voted to declare Divus, name, est. He is divine. Temples were built. Statues erected. A new cult began, worshipping the emperor as a deity. Citizens lit incense and whispered prayers. Coins bore his face with stars around. In the Roman mind, he was not gone. He had simply moved up the political side. But behind the ritual was power. A new emperor watched the fire. Supporters whispered in shadows. The people weighed loyalty. The dead emperor's funeral was also the birthplace of the next reign. Rome never truly paused. Even in mourning, it moved forward. The memory endures. For decades, citizens said, when he ruled, the grain was cheap. He built the roads. He loved the games. He became a star. And when they passed his temple, they left coins or olives. Because though the fire ended, the light remained. The dead did not always stay silent in Rome. Sometimes, they knocked. Lemures, the restless dead. In Roman belief, not every soul passed peacefully. Some became lemures. Restless, wandering spirits who returned because they were buried improperly, forgotten by family, died violently or unjustly, left promises unfulfilled. They were not demons, but souls in need of closure. Signs of their return. Romans believed ghosts returned through nightmares, cold drafts without wind, shadows with no source, flickering lamps, sudden silences among birds, a soft sigh behind you, a name whispered with no lips moving, a dream that wasn't just a dream. They didn't always bring fear. Sometimes, just a message. Dreams from the dead. Romans believed the dead could speak through dreams. In the night, a grandmother might appear, offering figs, saying nothing, but looking peaceful. Or a fallen soldier may weep beside his wife's bed. People awoke with tears and wrote it down. Then went to the tomb, left bread, lit oil, spoke the name aloud. Because they knew. Even in dreams, the dead asked to be remembered. The festival of Lemuria. Every year in May, on the 9th, 11th, and 13th, Romans observed Lemuria, a private night ritual to banish angry spirits. The paterfamilias, family head, would rise at midnight and walk barefoot, wash his hands thrice, throw black beans over his shoulder, whisper, with ease, I redeem me and mine. He did this 9 times, without looking back. Because if he did, he might see who followed. Ghosts in the streets. Even in public, ghosts were feared. At old crossroads. In abandoned baths. On hills where battles had spilled blood. Inside cracked tombs left unsealed. People avoided certain streets at dusk. Some carried iron amulets. Others wore rings carved with Mercury's staff. Because Rome was old. And old cities have long memories. Ghost stories in Rome. Writers told tales of ghosts. A chained spirit haunting a house in Athens. A young girl in a tunic appearing at dawn near her unmarked grave. A soldier's ghost guarding a bridge he died defending. Pliny the Younger famously recorded, there was a house in Rome, where chains clanked at night. They dug beneath the floor, and found bones. Spirits of comfort. Not all returning dead brought fear. Some came to watch over loved ones. A child appearing beside her brother's cradle. A mother visiting her daughter's wedding in a dream. A friend sitting beside a fire, long after death. These were not haunts. They were homecomings. How to help a ghost rest. Romans believed you could calm a spirit by whispering their name aloud, visiting their tomb, pouring milk or wine, lighting an oil lamp at night, finishing something they left undone. Because sometimes, the dead did not want revenge. They just wanted to be seen. After all, in Rome, to fear ghosts was natural. But to forget them? That was the greater horror. Because a ghost is not just a visitor. It is a memory knocking. And memory, in a city of stone and silence, was the one thing Rome refused to bury. To the Roman philosopher, death was not a wall. It was a mirror. Death is a daily companion. Philosophers like Seneca, Cicero, and Epictetus wrote about death not as fear, but as awareness. Let death be before your eyes daily. Seneca wrote, and you will never be enslaved again. They believed, Knowing you will die makes you free. Remembering mortality makes you grateful. Speaking of death makes you wise. Memento mori, remember you must die. This phrase wasn't morbid. It was liberating. Roman generals, during triumphs, had slaves whisper in their ears, Memento mori. You are mortal. You will end. In the peak of celebration, they reminded themselves, this, too, will pass. Stoicism and the soul. The Stoics taught, the soul is reason. Death is natural. Grief must not master the self. Seneca wrote letters about death like prayers. The body is a rented house. The soul, a traveler passing through. Cicero on legacy. Cicero, who saw war, betrayal, and death firsthand, said, the life of the dead is placed in the memory of the living. He did not fear being forgotten, because he wrote himself into time. To Cicero, death was not an erasure, but a transition of voice. The art of the good death. Romans valued not just life, but how one died. A good death meant dying with calm, making peace with family, facing it without denial, speaking final words of wisdom. To die trembling was un-Roman. To die speaking truth was honor. The corpse as teacher. Even dead bodies were philosophical objects. Some schools allowed observation of decay, study of cremation ash, meditation in tombs, because watching death unfold helped the philosopher unfold the self. Poetry of mortality. Poets like Ovid and Lucretius wrote of dust, silence, and stars. We were once stardust, and shall return to it, said Lucretius. He believed death was nothing. The soul dissolves. The fear is an illusion. Yet the words he left behind still echo like breath in a tomb. The peace and acceptance. To a Roman thinker, accepting death brought wisdom, lightness, joy. Because if nothing lasts, then everything matters more. Rome itself is mortality. Finally, Rome's thinkers knew even Rome would one day fall. Temples would crack. Stones would fade. But if memory remained, so did Rome. We are not immortal, Seneca wrote. But what we do, echoing rightly, might be. In the streets of Rome, laughter echoed. But in its soil, many of those laughs had already vanished. The fragility of childhood. In ancient Rome, 1 in 3 children died before age 5. Illness, malnutrition, fever, and plague were common. Even wealthy families faced frequent loss. There were no vaccines, no modern medicine, just hope, herbs, and prayers. And sometimes, hope wasn't enough. When a child died, if a child died under 40 days old, there was no official funeral, no public mourning allowed. Some weren't even named yet. The body was wrapped in cloth, placed in a clay jar, dolia or amphora, buried beneath a family home, under floors, in gardens, near the hearth. It was quiet, private, full of ache. The mother's grief. Though ritual was limited, a mother's sorrow was boundless. Many women lit tiny oil lamps every night, placed toys or pins at the burial spot, wove names into cloth or whispered them during chores, left milk at doorsteps just in case. She may have had no tomb to visit, but her arms still held the absence. Children in the tomb. For children older than infants, small sarcophagi were carved with lambs, doves, or flowers. Tombs often had inscriptions like, she played with dolls. Now the stars play with her. He laughed at rain. He now sleeps in light. These graves were often covered with pebbles, figurines, seashells, dried wreaths of wildflowers. Because a child's tomb was a place of tenderness, not grandeur. Dolls and toys left behind. Archaeologists have found ivory rattles, wooden dolls, miniature dishes, bronze bells, left beside tiny skeletons. Rome grieved through playthings. A final lullaby in the language of childhood. Poems for the lost. Some Roman parents composed epitaphs and poetry. My little Livia, who touched the sun with her smile, sleeps now where I cannot reach. But when the fig trees bloom, I feel her laugh in the leaves. Rome had no cure for such sorrow, but it had words. A child's spirit. Romans believed young children had gentler souls. Some said they became lares, household spirits. They returned in dreams, smiling. They wandered gardens as butterflies. Others believed they were closest to the gods. Too innocent for the world. Called home early. The smallest graves remembered. Even today, in Roman ruins, you'll find little sarcophagi. Beneath courtyards, beside wells, near kitchens. They were not forgotten. The homes kept them close. Because they were never meant to be far. Some in Rome lit fires. Others lit lamps. But the poets and mourners lit ink. Letters to the lost. Romans often wrote letters to the dead. Folded and placed in tombs. Or whispered beside ash urns, they wrote. To my dearest Marcus. You would have been 10 today. The garden blooms without you. I do not. Or, Julia, my light. I still sleep on your side of the bed. Come back in dreams. Some sealed these letters in lead tablets. And buried them with keepsakes. Cicero's letter of grief. When Cicero lost his beloved daughter Tullia. His grief was public, raw, and literary. He wrote, I have lost the one thing that tied me to life. The stars do not shine. The forums feel hollow. He built her a shrine. And considered retiring from politics altogether. A man of reason. Undone by the unreason of loss. Ovid in the morning poem. Poet Ovid wrote elegies not just for lovers, but for the dead. Though her face fades from marble, she walks the Tiber still. I smell her perfume in fig leaves. She lives in twilight. Roman poetry was full of moonlight, memory, names etched like wounds, hope turned into song. The tomb inscriptions. Gravestones often bore poetic verses. Stranger, do not hurry past. I was once what you are. I loved figs, games, and warm baths. Speak my name, and I will hear. These weren't just epitaphs. They were requests. The dead asking the living to keep the conversation alive. Words of widows and parents. Letters from wives said, I wash your cup still, though you no longer drink. I sleep with your robe folded beside me. Fathers wrote. You were 5. You laughed at olives. I kept the toy chariot. Mothers wrote. I gave you life. And now, life gives me only dreams of you. Letters never sent. Some never delivered their grief. They wrote on pottery shards, wax tablets, fabric scraps, the underside of amphorae, and hid them, because Rome believed. Even unseen words reached the shades. Reading grief aloud. In some homes, letters were read aloud during parentalia. The family sat by lamplight, and one by one, read from scrolls. Letters to fathers, letters to sons, even love notes, faded with time, but not with feeling. This was not theater. This was remembrance with voice. Grief is writing, writing is immortality. Rome had no therapy, but it had ink. It had poets. It had grave scribes. It had lovers writing on walls. I miss you. Even still. Even now. Even always. In life, Romans walked the forum. In death, they slept beside the roads. Where were Romans buried? Roman law forbade burials within the city walls. So graves were placed along major roads, like the Appian Way. In designated necropolises, cities of the dead. In catacombs beneath the surface. As you left the city, you walked past generations asleep. The roadside tombs. Wealthy Romans built monumental tombs along roads, shaped like pyramids, towers, or round domes, decorated with reliefs, columns, and inscriptions, facing traffic, so every passerby would see and remember. Even in death, they wanted to be seen. Famous example. Tomb of Caecilia Metella, a towering mausoleum outside Rome. Middle class and poor graves. Not all could afford grandeur. Many were buried in columbaria, underground chambers with small niches for urns. Simple grave plots with wooden markers. Shared tombs with inscriptions carved together. Still, love was present. For my wife, who made bread like the morning Sunday. For my brother, a fisherman, taken by fever. The catacombs. Rome's catacombs were vast underground networks, used especially by Christians. Jews. Minority communities. Carved into soft volcanic rock, tufa, they included narrow tunnels, rows of burial niches, loculi, wall paintings of doves, fish, grapes, shepherds, secret chambers for worship and memorials, a place of quiet faith and resistance to forgetfulness. Tomb inscriptions and imagery. Many tombs bore Latin inscriptions of name, age, virtues, carvings of banquets, animals, mythological scenes, prayers to gods like Dispater, Mercury, or Libidina, symbols of rebirth, vines, eggs, butterflies. Even the walls said, "This life passed, but left behind beauty." The necropolises. Necropolis means city of the dead. These were organized like towns. Paths and streets between tombs. Stone benches for visiting family. Fountains, shrines, gardens. They weren't just places of sorrow. They were places of connection. Families came on anniversaries, brought food, music, sometimes even laughter. Personal shrines and offerings. Romans left coins, bread, wine, flowers, dolls and tools, terracotta figurines. Each object was a sentence, each offering a whisper. I remember you. You are still here. You mattered. The eternal presence. Even today, in ruins and under roads, these tombs remain. Tourists walk past them. Scholars study them. Families once cried over them. They may not speak aloud, but if you stand still, they hum. In Rome, even death had its gods, and the road to the underworld had a name, a map, and a guardian. Dispater, the lord of the underworld. Dispater was the Roman god of the underworld and riches. He ruled over tombs, spirits, hidden treasures beneath the earth. He was associated with the Greek Hades, but Romans saw him less as terrifying, and more as unchanging, steady, vast, quiet. Offerings to Dispater were made at night, in black animals, usually sheep, without music, without applause. He was not to be pleased, only respected. Proserpina, queen of the underworld. Proserpina, wife of Dis, was the Roman version of Persephone. Her story, taken from the world of the living, became queen of the dead, returned each spring, bringing life back. She symbolized seasons, rebirth, grief that cycles. Roman women prayed to her for fertility, safe childbirth, dreams of lost loved ones. Mercury, the soul's escort. Mercury, god of communication and travel, also had the duty of psychopomp, the guide of souls. After death, Mercury was believed to meet the soul. He led them to the gates of the underworld. He did not judge, only delivered. He carried the caduceus, a winged staff with two snakes, symbolizing the path between life and death. Libidina, goddess of funerals. Libidina was the Roman goddess of death rituals and funerals. Her temple acted as a registry of the dead, a funeral coordination center, a shrine for offerings. Funeral workers were called libidinarii, and her name became a symbol of respectful death. He went to Libidina equals he passed away. Manas, the spirits of the departed. The Manas were not gods, but divine spirits of the honored dead. They were believed to live in tombs, protect descendants, receive offerings during Parentalia festival. Tombs often had inscriptions, Diem, dis manibus, to the spirits of the departed. Every grave was a shrine. Every ancestor, a watcher. Lemures and larvae, the restless dead. Lemures and larvae were the uneasy dead. Those who died without burial, were wronged, were forgotten. People feared them. They were warded off during Lemuria, with black beans, iron, and chants. Orcus, the Punisher. Orcus was a Roman underworld deity of oaths and punishment. He enforced broken promises, punished perjurers and death, guarded secret entrances to the underworld. Statues of Orcus often had grim faces, sometimes half lion, half man. He reminded Romans, the truth must follow you into death. Other figures. Nenia D, goddess of funerary lament. Summanus, god of night thunder and the lightning of the underworld. Tages, a child spirit associated with burial omens and Etruscan prophecy. Rituals of appeasement. Romans performed rituals to keep the gods of death benevolent. Burnt incense before tombs. Avoided loud noise near graveyards. Spoke the names of the dead out loud. Left honey, wine, or coins. Because divine silence could mean blessing. Or neglect. Death was divine. In Rome, death was not just an ending. It was a realm. With kings and queens. With priests and punishers. With gates, rivers, and shadows. And if one respected that world, it respected you back. To the Roman, death was not a door closing. It was a river to cross. The journey begins. After death, the soul, anima, began a voyage. Romans believed. The soul left the body quietly, passed through a liminal space between worlds, was greeted by a divine escort, often Mercury, approached the underworld's gate, shadowed and silent. This journey was neither feared nor rushed. It was inevitable, like dusk after day. The river crossing. Borrowed from Greek tradition. Romans believed in the river Styx. And the ferryman Charon. To cross. A coin, obol or denarius was placed under the tongue or on the eyes. The soul offered it to Charon. Only then could the journey truly begin. Without the coin, the soul wandered. Cold. Alone. Forgotten. Hence, Romans always prepared the dead with this final fare. The underworld, Orcus Inferi. The Roman underworld had dark fields, where most souls drifted. Ash trees, murmuring in dead winds. A gatekeeper dog, often Cerberus, from Greek myth. Shadows, not torment, just silence. It was not a hell of fire. It was a land of echoes. Judgment and paths. Some Romans believed in moral judgment. Souls were sent to Tartarus, for the wicked, betrayers, murderers, oath-breakers. Elysium, Elysian fields, for the heroic, wise, noble. The plain of Asphodel, for ordinary souls who lived simple lives. This mirrored Greek beliefs but took on Roman structure. Elysium, the blessed fields. Those who earned honor, valor, or divine favor, were sent to Elysium. Gentle sunlight. Singing birds. Fields of gold grain and white poppies. Rivers of honey and memory. Here, the soul wandered free. No sorrow. No illness. Only peace, eternal, quiet, golden. Ties to the living. Romans believed the soul remained connected. Through dreams. Through offerings. Through festivals like Parentalia in Lemuria. A well-remembered soul glowed brighter. A forgotten one dimmed into the fog. Thus, remembrance was immortality. The tomb as a portal. Romans sometimes saw tombs as gateways. Places where souls might pause. Wait, watch. Or even return briefly. Hence, they lit lamps. Whispered names. Left food and drink. Tombs were not ends. They were rest stops on the soul's eternal road. The soul's substance. Philosophers debated. What is the soul made of? Air? Breath? Light? A divine spark borrowed from the stars? Most agreed. Though the body turned to ash, the soul was not consumed. Visions of the beyond. Writers like Virgil, in the Aeneid, described. The hero Aeneas enters the underworld. Guided by the Sibyl. Sees ghosts, fathers, future kings. And finally walks through the gate of ivory back to life. This wasn't just story. It was Rome's map of the invisible. In the end, Romans didn't ask, is there life after death? They asked, will I be remembered after death? Because in Rome, the soul's journey did not end in the underworld. It ended in the memories of the living. The dead were not gone in Rome. They were invited home, once a year. What was Parentalia? Parentalia was a 9-day Roman festival, held every year from February 13th to 21st. In honor of the manes, spirits of the dead. It wasn't a public carnival. It was a private act of love. The rituals. Each Roman household prepared silent offerings at family tombs. Garlands of violets or roses. Grain, wine, salt, and bread. A sprinkle of milk or honey into the soil. Small lamps lit at dusk. No prayers were shouted. Everything was soft, slow, and reverent. The tomb was not feared. It was visited, honored, and spoken to. The role of the family. The pater familias, the head of the household, led the ceremonies. He would visit the ancestors' resting place, call out their names, place his hand on the stone, whisper, "You are remembered." Children watched in silence. Some repeated the names aloud, to learn where they came from. The mood of the city. During Parentalia, all temples closed. Marriages were forbidden. Public officials ceased business. Theaters fell silent. Rome itself slowed down. Because this was not for the gods above. It was for the ones beneath. The food of the dead. Romans believed the dead had gentle appetites. Offerings included crumbs, drops of wine, lentils, eggs, a pinch of salt, sometimes toys or tools they loved in life. Because a feast wasn't needed, presence was. The final day, Feralia. On February 21st, the last day of Parentalia, Romans observed Feralia, a solemn farewell. At dusk, a family member poured wine onto the grave, touched the stone 3 times, spoke final words aloud. Some even shouted into the wind, "Return to your sleep. We remember you. Stay in peace." It was both a blessing and a boundary. For those without graves, not every Roman had a tomb. Not every soul had a name remembered. So during Parentalia, Romans also left offerings. At crossroads, near fountains, on the ground itself, to honor the forgotten dead. Because no one deserved to vanish completely. What Parentalia meant. It was not just about mourning. It was about belonging, gratitude, continuity. It taught children, one day, you too will be remembered. And taught adults, you are not the first, and not the last. The dead were family still. Romans did not cut ties with the dead. They kept their portraits, their names in household prayers, their stories alive at meals. A Roman home was never fully empty, because the dead still lived in the walls, the soil, the breath of memory. The Romans feared forgetting more than dying. So they saved the face. The imagines, funeral masks. Roman noble families created wax death masks, called imagines, of their ancestors. These were made from wax, pressed gently on the face after death, painted to resemble lifelike features, stored in wooden cabinets in the atrium of the house, sometimes worn by actors during funerals. They were not grotesque. They were reminders of presence. The funeral procession. During elite funerals, actors wore these masks, dressed in the robes of the ancestors. Imagine a line of men, each wearing the face of a long-dead grandfather, walking in silence behind the bier. The message was clear. This man does not die alone. His lineage walks with him. The atrium of memory. In patrician homes, masks were displayed in cabinets. Visitors saw rows of faces, parents, grandparents, great-grandparents. Beneath them, inscriptions of names and offices held. The silent testimony of ancestry. A Roman child grew up surrounded by faces, learning. You are not just yourself. You are your blood. The power of ancestry. In politics, imagines were tools. A senator might gesture to them during speeches. My family has served Rome for centuries. The masks gave way to words, because the dead stood witness. Beyond nobles, while the elite had wax masks, common Romans preserved faces differently. Painted portraits on wood or plaster, terracotta busts, simple carved reliefs on tombstones. Even in humbler forms, the desire was the same, to hold on to a face. Why the face? For Romans, the face was identity. It held memory more than name or voice. To see the face was to feel presence. Thus, masks weren't just objects. They were living memory, breathing through wax. The masks as teachers. A Roman child, looking at those masks, learned duty to family, duty to ancestors. That life was short, but name and face could endure. The masks whispered silently, live well. For one day, you too will be a face remembered. Philosophical meaning. Death masks symbolized the fight against forgetting, the belief that remembrance is a second life, the binding of family across centuries. They blurred the line between living and dead. They made homes into temples of memory. In the end, a Roman death mask was not death. It was continuity. A soft, wax face, preserved so that the living never felt entirely alone. The Romans did not just bury their dead. They burned them into memory. Why cremation? In early and classical Rome, cremation was the primary rite. They believed fire purified the body. Smoke carried the soul upward. Ashes were easier to keep, honor, and protect. Fire was not destruction. It was transition. The funeral pyre. A cremation began with the building of a pyre. Logs carefully stacked in layers. Oils, incense, and herbs poured between. The body laid in the center, dressed in robes. Tokens placed around, weapons, jewelry, food, flowers. Relatives stood nearby. Their faces lit with firelight and tears. Lighting the fire. The closest male relative lit the pyre. This act was sacred. A duty. A farewell. A gift of release. The flames rose. Crackling wood. The scent of resin and myrrh. The body becoming light, ash, and memory. Watching the flames. Families stayed until the fire dimmed. Some cried aloud. Some whispered names. Some stood in silence, watching the transformation. In that moment, grief and ritual were one. Collecting the ashes. When the fire cooled, bones and ashes were gathered carefully, washed with wine, placed in urns of clay, glass, marble, or bronze. Children's urns were often small, decorated with doves or flowers. Adults' urns bore inscriptions. Here rests Gaius, loved and remembered. Burial of the urn. The urn was then placed in a family tomb, stored in a columbarium, NIS niche wall, sometimes buried under the earth, with a marker above. Offerings of bread, wine, and oil were left. The tomb was sealed, but the memory remained open. The symbol of fire. To Romans, fire meant purification, cleansing the mortal shell. Release, setting the soul free. Continuity, flame passing like a torch between generations. The smoke carried whispers upward. To gods, to ancestors, to eternity. Exceptions and shifts. Poorer families sometimes buried bodies instead, cheaper and simpler. By the late Empire, Christianity brought burial back into prominence. But cremation always lingered as a symbol of Rome's ancient identity. The memory of ashes. Romans visited urns as if they were whole bodies. They spoke aloud. You are here still. Because to them, ashes were not absence. They were concentrated presence. In the end, the fire was never just fire. It was a gate, a prayer, a bridge. From flesh to flame. From flame to smoke. From smoke to memory. Rome trusted the fire to hold what they could not. When an emperor died, Rome itself wore black. When a general fell, the legions marched one last time. The imperial funeral pyre. For an emperor, a massive pyre, sometimes several stories tall, was built in the Campus Martius. Decorated with gold, ivory, and silken banners. Statues, armor, and even captured enemy weapons placed around. Perfumes and spices, frankincense, myrrh, cinnamon, filled the air. It was not just a farewell. It was a spectacle of empire. The procession. The body was carried in state. On a gilded bier, draped in purple and laurel. Surrounded by soldiers, senators, priests. Actors wore masks, images of dead ancestors, marching silently. Musicians played flutes and trumpets. Crowds filled the streets, chanting the name of the deceased. It was not mourning alone. It was theater, ritual, and politics. The apotheosis, becoming a god. At the pyre's peak, an eagle was released into the sky as the flames roared. Romans believed this eagle carried the emperor's soul upward, to join the gods. This was called apotheosis. It transformed rulers into divine beings. Temples were built afterward. Shrines raised, cults formed. The emperor did not simply die. He changed realms. Generals and victors. Generals too received lavish funerals. Soldiers marched with weapons reversed, tips downward, in mourning. Standards and banners draped in black. War spoils displayed alongside the coffin. Veterans wept openly, calling out his victories. For them, the funeral was a last campaign march, a reminder of loyalty that went beyond the grave. Julius Caesar's funeral, one of the most famous, held in the Forum itself. His body burned on a public pyre, as citizens rioted in grief and rage. Mark Antony gave his legendary speech, turning sorrow into fury, and sorrow into revolution. Caesar's funeral changed Rome forever. Contrast with ordinary funerals, where the poor had silence, the powerful had echoes that shook the city. The elite funerals were political theater, family legacy, religious transformation. They reminded Rome, even in death, power speaks. Memory cast in stone. After grand funerals, monuments were raised. Mausoleums, like Augustus' towering tomb on the Campus Martius. Triumphal statues, arches, inscriptions. Coins minted with Divus Divine beside their names. The funeral was not an end. It was the beginning of immortal memory. In the end, Rome measured greatness, not only in life, but in how death was staged. For emperors and generals, a funeral was not closure. It was the final performance of empire. Rome's tears had women's voices. Soft, loud, whispered, or broken. The role of women in funerals. Roman funerals could not be imagined without women. They were the keepers of mourning. Wives tore their hair and beat their breasts. Mothers wailed, calling out their children's names. Sisters and daughters walked barefoot, veiled in black. Professional mourning women, prefeci, sang dirges aloud. The men buried, but the women grieved for all to see. Mother's grief. The loss of a child was one of Rome's most written sorrows. Mothers often cried at graves. I gave you life. You gave me joy. Now I give you tears. They kept locks of hair, toys, tiny sandals, and whispered lullabies at tombs. Rome respected maternal mourning. It was considered the truest sorrow. Wives and widows. Widows wore dark robes for months, sometimes for life. They prayed at the tomb, pouring oil and wine, sleeping beside the stone, speaking as though the husband still lived. Some swore eternal loyalty, refusing remarriage, choosing instead to remain half alive. Daughters and sisters. Young women lamented differently. They often wove garlands for tombs, sang hymns at festivals like Parentalia, and kept their father's or brother's memory alive in daily prayer. For them, grief was not just tears. It was song and offering. Professional mourners. Wealthy funerals often hired prefeci, women trained to cry, sing, and wail in rhythm. Their chants named the virtues of the dead, called out to ancestors, raised the funeral into theater. Some Romans criticized it as excess, but to many, it gave voice to the sorrow they could not speak. The symbol of hair and clothes. Mourning women showed grief with their bodies, tearing hair loose, wearing plain black or gray robes, going barefoot, covering faces with ashes. The body itself became an instrument of grief. Women as keepers of memory. Long after the funeral, women remained guardians, visiting tombs, teaching children the names of ancestors, telling stories at meals, keeping portraits dusted and offerings fresh. In this way, they carried Rome's memory forward. Voices that echoed. Roman poets often wrote that the city wails through women, because while men fought wars, it was women who taught Rome how to feel loss. In the end, mothers, wives, daughters, they were not silent figures in funerals. They were the heartbeat of mourning. Their voices made grief visible. Their rituals made memory last. In Rome, children were both blessings and fragile flames. Too often, the flame flickered out too soon. Childhood in ancient Rome. Roman childhood was full of joy, toys, games, learning, the laughter of siblings. But it was also fragile. Infant mortality was high. Illness, fever, and accidents claimed many young lives. Some never reached their first year. So every child who lived became a miracle remembered. When a child died, a child's death brought silence to a Roman household. Cradles left empty. Tiny sandals stored away. Mothers singing lullabies to stone urns. The pain was sharper because of innocence lost. The child's funeral. Children were often buried quickly, with small rites, wrapped in simple cloth, not the full toga, laid in tiny sarcophagi, decorated with playful carvings, or cremated, with ashes placed in delicate urns. Tombs of children often showed doves, butterflies, flowers, scenes of play, balls, dolls, animals, symbols of innocence and purity. Words on their tombs. Inscriptions revealed raw grief. To my son, who lived 5 years, 2 months, 3 days. You left before you learned your letters, but we write your name. We fed you milk, now we feed your tomb with tears. Even ordinary Romans carved their sorrow in stone. The mother's lament. For mothers, child loss was the deepest wound. They tore hair, beat their chests, and sometimes spent years visiting the grave daily. Some whispered, "Stay close. Sleep, but stay." The bond of womb and child made their grief eternal. The father's role. Fathers expressed grief differently. Some wrote poetry. Others built shrines. One grieving father wrote, "You were small in life, but in memory you are vast." For them, loss was both personal and ancestral. A break in the family line. Siblings, brothers and sisters often visited tombs, leaving toys or flowers. Some inscriptions. To my brother, who will never play again. Children kept mourning alive in innocent gestures. Festivals and memory. During Parentalia, families honored even the youngest lost. They placed bread crumbs and milk for them, believing the small souls still hungered. The act itself was tender. Rome remembered even those who had barely touched life. The philosophy of child death. Philosophers reflected. Stoics taught acceptance, life is a loan, not a possession. Epicureans urged not to fear death, for it was only sleep. But families could not be so calm. Their grief was raw, human, unsoftened. In the end, children were fragile candles. Some burned long, some barely flickered. But Rome never forgot. Their toys became offerings. Their names became whispers. Their graves became gardens. The Romans built roads for the living. But they also built pathways for the dead. Death as a companion. For Romans, death was not a stranger. It was a neighbor. Always nearby. Always expected. They lived knowing every banquet might be the last. Every soldier's march might end in silence. Every mother's lullaby might one day echo at a tomb. This awareness did not break them. It made them live more deeply. The ritual of continuity. Across the centuries, from huts of shepherds to marble palaces, Romans kept the same vows. To light the fire. To whisper the name. To leave bread, wine, and flowers. To keep memory alive. Because forgetting was the true death. The meeting of worlds. Funerals were not endings. They were meetings. Between the living and the dead. The family and the ancestors. The body and the divine. In every funeral, Rome said, "You are not gone. You are transformed." The silence of the tombs. Walk through the ancient Via Appia today. Lined with tombs of nobles, soldiers, children, freedmen. Each stone whispers, "I was loved. I served Rome. Do not forget me." The road itself became a library of grief. A city of silence beside the city of life. The gift of memory. Rome's greatest invention was not roads, aqueducts, or empire. It was remembrance. Masks in the atrium. Inscriptions on marble. Lamps in tombs. Festivals of ancestors. Through these, Rome gave every soul, rich or poor, a chance to live again in memory. The eternal fire. Picture one last Roman pyre. The flames rise. The crowd gathers. The smoke curls upward into twilight. For a moment, time holds still. And in that silence, Rome teaches us. Death is not erasure. It is continuity, carried in names, faces, and stories. Closing reflection. The Roman funeral was not only about loss. It was about connection, across generations. Hope, for some form of afterlife. Love, the bond that outlives flesh. And so, even 2,000 years later, we can stand before their tombs and feel them near. Because Rome's true empire was not carved in stone, but in memory.